Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Best Polish Restaurant in Buffalo by William Kowalski, narrated by Elizabeth Wiley. The modern Polish joke has its origins in the anti-Polish sentiment that took root in Germany during the Third Partition of Poland in 1795. Mockery of the Poles was encouraged by the authorities in order to justify the theft of an entire nation. You wouldn't take the land of someone you regarded as an equal, but you had no problem stealing from someone if you thought they were less than human. Excerpted from A Cultural History of the Polish Joke, 1776 to 1976, the unfinished and unaccepted Ph.D. thesis of Witold Whitey Lubick. 1. Steerage Class, May 1908. There were no words in Aniela's native Polish dialect to describe the stench in steerage. Such an unnatural reek, as far as she knew, had never existed before in the history of the world. It was an affront to all humanity. Livestock vomit, unwashed bodies, fetid breath, soiled clothing, bad food, devilish machines creating unholy smells, and not a breath of a breeze to blow any of it away. It was a smell so bad that it had convinced her, just one day into their journey across the Atlantic, that she, her mother, and her sisters had made a horrible mistake by leaving home. She knew lots of words for smells, all right. There was the smell of kielbasa boiling in the iron pot over the fire in the old stone hearth, along with potatoes and wild herbs. There were the odors of horse and oxen manure in the road, highly distinct from the stink of her father's and brother's thunder jugs, which she had to empty every morning so that their lordships would not be unduly put out by having to do it themselves. There were smells of vodka and onions on the breath of faces pushed too close to hers, of the priest's unwashed, stale clothing, of the beeswax candles that burned at our Saviour's feet every Sunday morning. It was as if she was a nature girl, part animal maybe, some kind of creature that defined the world by the scents it gave off. Sometimes memories of odd smells even crept into her head unbidden, and that was why she suddenly remembered that once, just a few years ago, there had been the disappointing smell of the ermine furs that the szlachcianka wore as she swept grandly through the village within inches of Aniela's nose. That had been a strange day. Under an alignment of the stars that not even the wisest old woman in the village could have predicted, the szlachcianka's grand carriage had stopped directly in front of the astonished Aniela as she was running an errand for her mother right there on the main street where everyone could see. That, in and of itself, was a piece of good luck. It was not every day that a poor girl like her got to see someone so grand. It would be something to tell her family about when she returned home. She was already memorizing the details to repeat later. The carriage was black. It was pulled by a white gelding and a roan. The driver wore a fancy jacket with embroidery on the collar. There was mud on the left sleeve. Fortune continued to unfold as the carriage door opened and the lady herself exited, assisted by the gloved hand of her hired man. By this time, Aniela was so surprised she could do nothing more than stand with her mouth agape. She had never been this close to nobility before. She walked like royalty, furs on her shoulders. Her man held her dress out of the mud for her. She did not look to the left or to the right, but only straight ahead, like she didn't care about anything. Things became even stranger when the lady stopped on her way into the shop, the front door of which Aniela herself was blocking, due to her own clumsy farm-girl absent-mindedness, until she remembered to bend one knee in a rarely used curtsy and step out of the way. She half expected the footman to cuff her on the side of the head, or at least to hear angry words. But the footman didn't even notice her, and the szlachcianka was not angry. She paused, one booted foot on the step, and she looked Aniela up and down. Aniela was younger then, barely a woman yet, but the way this pania looked at her seemed to suggest she thought she was older than she actually was, a rival or even a threat, perhaps. That was ridiculous. Aniela would never think to compare herself to a woman who lived in a house separate from her animals, whose husband owned no less than 4 horses, who ate from china plates, who drank wine instead of vodka, who had a family pew at the front of the church, who was so close to God, in fact, that she even had her very own chapel on her estate, in case she didn't feel like worshipping amongst the great unwashed. Yet the woman's stare was not unkind. There was even the hint of a smile about her face as she said, in a haughty, refined Prussian dialect, "This one imagines she's going places in life, doesn't she?" That was when the smell of the furs had come to her nostrils as the woman swept past. To Aniela's nose, they smelled just like what they were, the dead skins of dead animals, worn for show, devoid of life, possibly home to several different kinds of insects, and, like so many other things in life, rather disappointing when viewed up close. Why had the Schlachtjanka said that about her? Aniela imagined no such thing about herself. She did not see herself as the kind of girl who would be going places. The furthest she could imagine was Poznań, a very long day's ride from the village. But why she would ever go there she could not begin to fathom. She had never been to Poznań, except when she was baptized, which, of course, she did not remember, and she had no desire or reason to go there. Her entire life was there in the village, and on the farm just outside, where she lived with her parents, her 3 brothers, and her 2 sisters. Poznań had nothing to do with anything. All the more reason, then, to be amazed at the latest turn her life had taken, for here she was now in the hold of a ship that was the biggest thing she had ever seen, headed across the ocean for America, much farther than Poznań, and infinitely more frightening. She shook her head to clear it, and looked around again in the gloom of steerage, surprised to find herself back here after her momentary flight back to Poland, surprised and disappointed. She didn't know exactly where in the world she wanted to be right now, but she was quite sure she didn't want to be where she was. The ship itself was an experience never to be forgotten. It was so big that when she first saw it at the docks in Hamburg, she couldn't believe it was actually floating. It was 10 times bigger than the biggest building she had ever seen, bigger than the cathedral in Poznań, which was, according to her mother, the largest thing on the earth. Only through a tremendous act of will had she managed to quell the terror she felt as they crossed the quivering gangplank and stepped onto the deck. The ship bore the name of the man whom Poles hated more than the devil himself, Kaiser Wilhelm II. It was a cruel twist of fate that the vessel should be named for the very person from whose clutches they were being delivered, the man who had decreed that all Poles were animals and should either be Germanized or put down like dogs. A bad omen, to be sure. Aniela crossed herself and tried not to cry. She could hear her mother muttering under her breath, and she knew she was praying to St. Christopher, the patron saint of travelers. She had begun importuning this particular saint long before their journey began. The words failed to comfort her. They only served to convince her that something terrible was happening, for when else did anyone in her family pray out loud? Her terror had grown as they were promptly ushered into the dank netherworld of the steerage hold. This was where they were to stay, they were told. They were not free to wander about the ship as they pleased, not even to get a breath of fresh air. That was a luxury reserved for the higher-paying passengers. The crew of the ship was dreadfully rude to them while they were boarding, as if they had been paid nothing at all for passage, but were doing some great favor. That was all right. The peasants who crammed the hold were used to rudeness. They'd always been treated that way by the Prussians, who had dominated their part of Poland for many years now, since the time of Aniela's great-grandparents and before. They knew not to react to such treatment. They didn't even waste energy resenting it, since there was nothing they could do to change it. It was being trapped inside that Aniela couldn't stand. She wasn't used to being cooped up like a chicken. Immediately she felt the first pangs of fear, and her heart began to flutter against her rib cage. This floating prison, she was sure, was the place where she would die. She began to panic. At least she thought that was what was happening to her. Her breath came short and fast, and she felt like she was going to faint. This alone was even more frightening, for she was not the sort of girl who felt fear of anything much, and so her fear fed on itself, and it grew. But eventually common sense prevailed. Aniela was a very practical girl. She reasoned that there had been other ships in the history of the world, and that those ships had managed to float. She knew that this ship had crossed the ocean before, and so therefore it, too, could float. That had been demonstrated. They would not sell tickets on a ship if they knew it would sink. Or would they? Perhaps it was all some elaborate Prussian plot to drown them. The Germans were always threatening to rid the world of their presence, after all. No, she would not really believe it floated until she saw it with her own eyes. And the smells, drogi Boże, the smells. They made their crossing in May. A storm had kicked up on their second day at sea and raged for a day and a night. Now the ocean continued to toss. Those who hadn't been made ill by the constant up and down of the waves were sickened by the vomit that spilled from buckets and sloshed around the floorboards. Because of that, few passengers had the stomach for the slop the crew served from the massive kettles at one end of the hold. Those who did have the strength to eat were often pushed out of line and forced to the back by the youngest and strongest men who, with none of their own elders around to chastise them, had quickly taken to behaving like wolves. It was as if they were reverting to their animal natures. Well, what did one expect from men? They were scarcely better than the livestock. If you knew how to handle them, they were just as easy to manage. But if you let them think for one moment they could have their way, then have it they would. So you did not give them an inch of room, and if they insisted on behaving like animals, you treated them the way you did a recalcitrant beast. You beat them hard, you did not back down, and you never let them know they were stronger. There were other hardships to contend with, too. The women had none of the privacy to which they were entitled. They had to do their business in buckets, right out in the open, in front of the leering wolves. That kind of indignity was the normal state of affairs for Aniela, who had had to put up with worse from her brothers. That didn't make this any easier to bear, though. It only served to reinforce her opinion that no man was to be trusted even for a moment, no matter how convincing he was. Well, all except for Martin. He was the baby of the family, and of all the boys, he was the kindest, the sweetest, and the most easily tormented. He was the only one Aniela would miss, but she knew her sisters felt the same. Her mother had refused to weep when they left, but Martin, 15 years old, had cried openly as the wagon went down the road. It was a memory Aniela knew she would never be able to erase from her mind, no matter what. The only blessing was that down here in the hold it was hard to see. There were just 3 or 4 kerosene lamps. The only other light came through the portholes or down the hatches, and so everything was perpetually hidden in gloom, if not outright darkness. This was the only protection afforded their modesty. Of course, darkness brought its own terrors, as any girl in this world of men knew all too well. They stayed together at all times, each one constantly checking to make sure the others were close by. They slept in shifts to ensure that no male dared try anything while they were asleep. They continued their prayers to St. Christopher, and they added new ones to St. Jude, the saint of lost causes, for by now they had begun to understand that their entire way of life was lost to them, and the odds against them surviving this journey were very great indeed. The strangest thing of all about this ship was that everyone was mixed together. Poles, Jews, Ruthenians, Bulgarians, Slovenians, Slovakians, Hungarians, Romanians, Russians, Bohemians, Bavarians. They huddled together in tribes, dividing themselves naturally according to language and culture, glaring at each other with suspicion. Aniela had not known such a mélange of humanity existed, nor that all these languages existed either. It was proof that the biblical story of the Tower of Babel was true. Some of these people she had never even heard of. She had seen Jews before, but she had never been this close to one, let alone whole families of them. She found herself observing them curiously, wondering if all the horrible things the priest had said about them were true. He had lied about practically everything else, after all, including his own divinity. These Jews appeared to be serious, grim people. They kept to themselves, and they regarded everyone around them with mistrust. But then so did everyone else. All in all, despite their funny locks of hair that curled down from the men's ears, and the strange clothing styles of the women, they did not seem so different. Regardless of where they came from, they were all in the same boat now, Aniela reflected, and that was true in more ways than one. Once they were out to sea, they were allowed on deck, but never more than an hour at a time. That, too, was a privilege reserved for the wealthier passengers. For the most part, the people in steerage had to rely on the hatches and the tiny portholes for fresh air, and those had to be closed in heavy seas. Imagine putting a cricket in a filthy cup and shaking it. That's how she would describe this journey to her best friend, Agnieszka, if she ever saw her again. Which she wouldn't, because Agnieszka was not going to America, and neither of them had gone to school long enough to learn how to write a whole letter to each other. So everything that happened to each of them from now on, for the rest of their lives, would remain a mystery to the other. This thought only contributed to the great hole she had felt growing in her middle ever since their wagon had pulled out of the village, and which threatened to consume her whole being. Aniela's mother, Zofia, lay on her bunk below Jadwiga, her elder sister. Aniela and her younger sister, Katerina, occupied the two facing bunks. Between them sat all the things they had brought from home, everything they could fit into one wagon. There were 4 flimsy wooden chests, one for each of them, plus a large steamer trunk. In the chests, each of them had put their most essential personal items, dresses, shoes, combs, and the like. In the trunk, Zofia had put certain things that no new home could do without: salt, earthenware bowls, a couple of knives, a large cooking pot with a lid, several hand-whittled wooden spoons, and other various and sundry implements. There were also several bits of white lace, handkerchiefs and doilies for the most part, which would serve no clear purpose, but which had been too precious to leave behind. Their most valued possessions were an ebony crucifix and an image of Our Lady of Czestochowa, the Black Madonna. That they had taken these items with them meant that their former home in the village was left without any holy images to protect it. But her father and brothers would not even notice. It would only be a matter of time before that house of men descended into total deviltry, Aniela knew. If they had left the lace behind, they would only have wiped their asses with it. She felt no guilt at abandoning them. Their decline had begun long before. She, her mother, and her sisters had set out on this path, not because of any great ambition, but as a matter of survival. In a small piece of crockery, covered carefully with oilcloth, was the bubbling sourdough mixture that Zofia had taken from its place on the kitchen sill, and which she fed occasionally with a piece of bread or a bit of water. If she could manage to get it across the ocean without killing it, it would flourish in the new land. It would be a living piece of home that would always be with them. That was what they would have to start their new lives in America: a few bits of clothing, some trinkets, 2 holy images, and the sourdough. Everything else had been left behind. Which was, of course, the point of leaving in the first place. Not everything that was gone would be missed. Better not to think about those things. Curiously, Aniela felt immune to seasickness. Her mother and sisters groaned as if they were having their innards pulled from them. Whenever they felt the need, they simply leaned over the edge of their bunks and were sick upon the floor. The overflowing buckets had long ago lost their usefulness, and the women had lost all dignity. Zofia, whom Aniela had never seen display any sort of emotion before, prayed openly for death. Other people in the steerage hold experienced even worse misery. A pregnant woman gave birth, The baby died. A day later, so did the mother. The whole ship grieved. It seemed to all of them to be a symbol of everything everyone had given up, no matter where they'd come from. All in all, this journey was worse than a nightmare. It was a living hell. The Slushchanka's words came floating back to her suddenly. "This one imagines she's going places in life, doesn't she?" At the time they had seemed like a taunt. Now they seemed like a prediction or an augury, such as one might read in coffee grounds or chicken entrails. Aniela didn't believe in practicing such things, because the priest said they were witchcraft. But she knew old women who did. And the words of the priest didn't stop her from knowing that their power was real. The only good things about this journey, in fact, was that no matter how bad it got, it would always be better than what they were leaving. The Prussians, her father, her brothers, all of it was behind her now. Maybe now, in her 16th year, she could finally start to live. 2. Kenmore, September 2015. On Delaware Avenue in the Buffalo suburb of Kenmore, a man named Iggy Podbielski stood in a parking lot with his hands on his hips, ruefully surveying the latest in a series of graffiti attacks on the wall of a certain building. This building looked to be a veteran of such attacks. Its walls bore the faded scars of previous attempts by so-called street artists to beautify it with cryptic tags in spray-paint neon colors. The tags had been painted over many times, but they always bled through. The result was an urban palimpsest. In a few centuries, Iggy thought, this wall might be a wealth of information to archaeologists trying to figure out what kind of place Buffalo had been. But of him there would remain not a trace. No one would remember his name, or that he had stood here. And if by some miracle they happened to find an old scrap of paper with the name Iggy Podbielski on it, a bill of lading or a receipt or something that had somehow survived the centuries unscathed, he would still mean no more to them than any old random Sumerian grain vendor whose thumbprint was still visible on a clay tablet 5,000 years after concluding his last deal. Jesus, how depressing, Iggy thought, staring at this ugly graffiti. It made you wonder what the hell the point of anything was. The building was an old place by modern standards. It had stood there since 1951. It was just 1 story tall, but it spread out across nearly 3,000 square feet. The exterior walls were fake stucco. They had begun to decay years earlier, the cement on the outside peeling away to reveal the rusted chicken wire underneath. A 20-foot-tall lighted sign in the parking lot read Angela's, but several of the letters had burned out a long time ago, so now it just said Ann L. Naturally, this was seized upon by every passing wit who thought he was the first to notice the similarity to a certain word pertaining to the human anatomy. Someone yelled it at him now, in fact, just another punk kid in a car. "Anal!" the kid yelled. "Best food in town!" Iggy didn't even bother looking. He just flipped a middle finger over his shoulder and continued to stare blankly at the graffiti. Once upon a time, he would have cared enough about his public reputation to avoid such childish reprisals. But once upon a time, the restaurant wouldn't have looked this bad either. Once upon a time, the parking lot would have been full of cars, and there would have been a line of people out the door every Friday night for the fish fry. Once, this was the best Polish restaurant in Buffalo, so good that even non-Polish people came there to sample the sausages, the cheeses, the pierogies, the smoked meat, the traditional breads and pastries. All kinds of people were welcome. Irish Americans, German Americans, Russian Americans, even black people. That was the rule that had been laid down when the place was founded by his great-grandmother. Everyone welcome. She had known all too well what it was like to be excluded. When you saw blacks and whites rubbing elbows on Delaware Avenue, you knew you were in a special place. And once upon a time, he would have had that sign fixed by now. But now there was no point. Iggy was 45 years old, tall, stoop-shouldered, pot-bellied, jug-eared, and at the moment he was profoundly unhappy. Along with several family members, most of whom he was scarcely speaking to, he was the owner of the building that he was currently staring at. Iggy was a so-called businessman, an erstwhile chef, a former dreamer of dreams, a man of the people with no people around him, a family man with no children, whose wife would rather watch reruns of Magnum P.I. or Tom Cruise movies on the internet all day than converse with him. And at this moment, he was a very disappointed man, which was made worse by the fact that his disappointment was largely directed at himself. Iggy was also the great-grandson of Angela, whose real name was Aniela. 107 years earlier, his great-grandmother had made the painful journey from Poland to start a better life. As had been explained to him approximately 10,000 times during his childhood, she had come to America because it was the place where anyone could get ahead if they worked hard enough. Free of the royal tyranny that had oppressed Europe for millennia, untainted by the endless strife between tribes, city-states, kingdoms, and nations, liberated from the classist oppression that made it impossible to rise above the station to which you were born, America was a magical place where the poorest peasant could create something from nothing. Except, apparently, for his family. It was the ruination of their American dream Iggy was staring at now. Iggy had heard the American Dream lecture so many times as a kid that back then it was all he thought about. Anyone could make it in America if they just worked hard, everyone said. His parents, his uncles, his cousins, his grandparents, even his great-grandmother herself, who had lived to be 98 years old. He had known her well, although he could barely understand her, since he didn't speak Polish, and she had never had more than a passing acquaintance with the English language. If you didn't make it in America, there was something seriously wrong with you. You just weren't trying. You didn't appreciate the sacrifice your ancestors had made on your behalf, leaving behind everything they held dear. Nope. If you didn't make it, you were a failure, not just in business, but as a person, and in the eyes of all those who had come before you. Iggy sighed and looked at the time on his cell phone. It was nearly time to start prepping for dinner. Yes, despite the fact that the restaurant looked as if it was already in the late stages of returning to the earth from which it had sprung, it was still open, and he was determined that he would not close early. Angela's hadn't served its last meal yet. That moment was still 3 days away. Iggy let himself into the kitchen through the back door. He flicked on the lights, listening automatically for the telltale scurry of little feet that would have indicated the presence of vermin. He heard nothing. He had always kept on top of the rat situation. The place might be going out of business, but it wasn't because of the health department. He went to the sink and washed his hands up to his elbows. This was a ritual he performed at least 24 times a day. Then he went to the cooler and thought about portions. How many people could he expect for dinner tonight? Probably none, he thought. People had simply stopped coming to Angela's, and that was why they were closing. Why was that? He thought he knew. It was outmoded, outdated, badly marketed. They didn't even have a website. Iggy hadn't seen the point in one. His teenaged and adult nephews and nieces thought this was the most ridiculous thing they'd ever heard of. How are people supposed to find Angela's if it didn't exist on the web, they said. Same way they always had, Iggy replied, by looking in the phone book, or driving by it, or word of mouth. If you made good food, people would come. But they made the same good food they always had, and nobody came. Iggy just didn't understand the internet, apparently. He knew how to use email and how to search for stuff on Google, but he could tell by the way the younger generation rolled their eyes and spoke to him with barely concealed impatience that there were entire levels of understanding of the online world that would always be beyond him. The real problem, he felt, was that nobody wanted stodgy old Polish food anymore. This wasn't 1950. It was 2015. People did not eat heaping plates of cabbage and egg noodles slathered with butter. They did not appreciate a
Sample complete. Ready to continue?